Hey everybody, in this video we're going to cover what sets social psychology apart from other sources of explanations for why people behave the way they do. And in that discussion, we'll discuss a little bit about one of the unique aspects of social psychology, at least what makes it unique from most of the other common sources of explanations for why people behave the way they do. So I'm going to share my screen so you have a visual aid to follow along with. All right, so first let's talk about probably the main source that most of us get the explanations we have for why people behave the way they do, and that is folk wisdom. All right, folk wisdom are those lay explanations that we get from our grandparents, from our parents, that we may even come up with ourselves, that we get from movies. These are general explanations for why different types of people do different types of things. All right, why, if you are the type to think that, men are all, sex hounds, right? Then that's that's why they, do certain things on dates. If you have an idea like that, then chances are you have that idea because you've either faced that experience, you've either come up with that experience independently, or you've been led to believe that from shows or movies or what have you. But the thing about folk wisdom is that whether it's true or not, folk wisdom has no way of ever knowing. All right, because folk wisdom just comes up with an explanation and leaves it there. All right, and there's no real criterion for these explanations when it comes to folk wisdom. All right, when it comes to common sense, all right, there's no real criteria upon which to base our decision about whether a explanation from folk wisdom is a good one. All right, and so you can come up with competing explanations. Opposites attract, birds of a feather flock together. These are both explanations that we get from folk wisdom, from common sense, but they contradict one another. All right, so folk wisdom has the biggest weakness of not even having a way to assess whether or not assess the accuracy of their explanations. Then you have art. Right, I've got a painting in here, but we could also talk about performance art. All right, in addition to the visual arts. Right, I mean, I like to do theater when I have the time, and you would not have to look very far or for very long to find a play that offers some explanation for some complex human experience or event. You wouldn't have to look very far or very long for that. Literature, same thing. These forms of art offer a window into certain experiences, and very often they will offer you some kind of an explanation for those experiences. But the problem is that these don't offer you anything in the way of verifiable truth. All right, do they give you something that is truth? Well, sure. I mean, I'm sure that the messages in those pieces of art are important. They're certainly impactful, and they're certainly worthwhile. But ultimately, if we really want to know, if we really want to understand, if we really want to be able to explain human behavior, we need to be able to not only come up with explanations like folk wisdom, art, and literature do, we also want to be able to test those hypotheses. We want to compare those explanations against some criteria. Now, philosophy and journalism, they kind of do that. They start going in the right direction, right? For philosophy, the explanations that it offers has to meet the standard of being logical or reasonable. And that's great. However, actual studies of human behavior have revealed that human behavior is not as straightforwardly logical as it seems. In fact, it's probably still a prevailing notion now that human behavior is not rational. Certain perspectives think that there is kind of a deep logic to it, meaning that there is a certain cold, ruthless logic to it, but it's not the logic that we think of. And then journalism, it tries to find other pieces of evidence that verify, some fact, but usually journalism is trying to explain one event, and it's really just trying to, find evidence for a particular interpretation of an event. Very rarely, though, does it try to identify some kind of explanation for behavior, right? So philosophy and journalism are going in the right direction, right? They're at least applying some criteria to whether or not an explanation for human behavior is accurate, but neither of them actually. So, for example, for philosophy stops at logical. If it's logical, if it's reasonable, if the best explanation, if the strongest argument can be given for this, they're done. All right. They don't need any evidence beyond that. For journalism, again, they're usually trying to explain single events or societal movements and things like that. All right. And so if they can find information about that past event, then great, they're looking for evidence that either backs up or doesn't a particular interpretation of that event. But they don't really look to understand behavior to the point of trying to predict it in the future. All right. So none of these sources give us verifiable explanations for human behavior. All right. And none of these, philosophy and journalism do a better job of this, but none of these really, once they come up with an explanation, none of them really test that explanation to the point of seeing whether or not that explanation can predict future instances. All right. And that's where the scientific process comes in. All right. Now, we talk a lot about social psychology being a science, and that seems a little confusing. It seems a little weird to most people who have never taken a psychology class, or certainly a social psychology class, because when they think of science, they think of physics, chemistry, biology, right? But those are fields that use the scientific method to study their subject matter. All right. They are not science. Science is an approach to evidence. It's an approach to evaluating evidence critically. So science is the process of coming up with a hypothesis, devising some way of testing that hypothesis. So coming up with some explanation, devising a way of testing that explanation that can be repeated, all right, and double-checked, triple-checked, quadruple-checked, checked 100 times, and then seeing whether that explanation is verified by that test, and whether it's always verified or verified the majority of the times, all right, that it's tested. So science is an approach to explanations, whether it's an explanations for the physical phenomena of the universe in physics, whether it's an explanation for biological phenomena in biology, whether it's a question about chemistry, or human social behavior. All of these use science because science is an approach to evaluating explanations for human behavior using the scientific method. All right. Now, social psychology in that way then differs from folk wisdom, from journalism, philosophy, art, and literature. One meme that often comes out is, psychology tells you what you already knew, but in fancier words. And sometimes that's right. I'm not saying that folk wisdom and art and literature and philosophy and journalism can't come up with the right answers. They certainly can. They can stumble across the right answers. The more astute the observer, the closer to the right answer they'll probably be. But none of those sources have a way to verify those explanations. And that's what science gives us. And that's why approaching these questions with the scientific method is the ideal way of approaching explanations in general. And if you're like me, because I'm a dork about most things, but especially human behavior. I mean, in my grad school days, I was a total creeper. I loved to go to coffee houses and people watch. I loved it, all right? And just look at all the quirks and oddities. And I'm a quirky guy. I'm an odd guy. Ask anybody who knows me. I'm probably one of the weirdest people they know, all right? So maybe that's it. Maybe that's why I like trying to figure out other people. Whatever the reason, I want to explain human behavior. And one of the best, most verifiable, most reliable ways of doing that is the scientific method. Now, social psychology is not the only science that studies human behavior. There are others. Within social psychology, we have fields like cognitive psychology, personality psychology, and clinical psychology. So clinical psychology is the study of abnormal human behavior, and normal is just defined by the average, all right? Well, oftentimes abnormal behavior is some oddity or extreme version of normal human behavior. And so social psychology can oftentimes lend some theoretical explanations to the study of clinical psychology. And so clinical and social tend to overlap a lot. In fact, at one point there was a clinical and social psychology PhD program. To this day, there is a Journal of Clinical and Social Psychology. All right, so clinical and social psychology tend to overlap a lot because we are a social animal. All right, and so it makes sense that a lot of our abnormalities would in some way relate to social life, and many of them do. Personality psychology is another field that's closely related to social psychology. So related, in fact, that the two are usually married. For example, there are several of our flagship journals combine the two. JPSP, the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, that's the flagship journal for social psychology. And it's the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. PSPB, Personality and Social Psychology Bulletin. PSPR, Personality and Social Psychology Review. SPPS, all right, Social Psychology and Personality Science, all right. These are all journals that couple personality and social psychology. Even the National Association of Social Psychologists is SPSP, the Society for Personality and Social Psychology. So personality psychology and social psychology are usually joined at the hip, all right? But in the strictest sense, they do have some basic difference, and the difference is primarily in focus. Personality psychology primarily focuses on individual differences, okay? Specific aspects of the person that lead them to behave differently in different situations. Now, social psychology traditionally has focused on the situation. What are differences in the situation that cause differences in people's behavior? But ever since Kurt Lewin, all right, social psychology has adopted an interactionist approach. Basically, how do people with different individual differences, like personality, behave differently across different situations? You know, if a group of friends approaches you and asks you to go to a party, are you more or less likely to say yes? Well, a personality psychologist might say, well, are you an introvert or extrovert? Right? Well, a social psychologist might, in the traditional sense, a social psychologist focusing only on the situation might say, well, who's asking? Right? Is it a group of people that you don't really know, or is it a group of friends? Right? Well, again, since Kurt Lewin, social psychology has adopted the interactionist approach, which is it's not just the situation, it's an interaction. So modern social psychology would try to address that question by saying, well, it depends not only on who's asking, group of friends, group of people you don't really know, but also your personality, an introvert versus an extrovert. You know, if it's a group of people you don't know, An extrovert might say yes, an introvert might say no. But if it's a group of friends asking, then there may not be any difference between extroverts and introverts. All right, so you see there's modern social psychology has adopted this interaction approach, which kind of swallows personality. And so they end up getting coupled together quite often. So they go together like that. Now, cognitive psychology, if you watch other videos that I've posted, came along in the 50s and 60s. So it came along several decades after social psychology did. But social psychology never had an organizing paradigm for the longest time, all right? And even to this day, it's largely a field of many theories. But after the cognitive revolution in the 50s and 60s, you had psychology professors teaching in PhD programs who were cognitive psychologists. And so they were training the next generation of faculty, the next generation of professors, the next generation of scientists in the 70s and 80s. And so you would have a lot of students who were getting their PhDs in social psych, but they were having to take classes from these cognitive psychologists. And so they would take these classes, they would learn about cognitive psychology, and a lot of social psychologists being trained by taking these classes started thinking, hey, I think I could use the cognitive paradigm to think about these social processes, these social psychological processes that we're studying. And so, even to the chagrin of many of the traditional social psychologists, that new generation, that generation of social psychology professors and scientists from the 70s and 80s, they started adopting the cognitive paradigm. And that was that social cognitive revolution. Now, so social psychology has adopted a lot from cognitive psychology. Cognitive psychology has not taken very much back. All right, a little bit here and there, but not much. Now, social psychology also relates to, that shouldn't say clinical psychology, sorry, that should say political science, sorry. Social psychology is also related to fields outside of psychology. In fact, one field that it gets very frequently confused with is sociology. And the principal difference is focus. Sociology studies groups. Social psychology studies individuals within groups. All right. So, sociologists, they care about, power structures, culture, things like that. And social psychology does too. But the difference is that sociology focuses on how this affects group behavior. We focus on how it affects individual behavior. Economics. All right, economics includes things. Economics is a direct product of human behavior. All right, trade, demand, all of it, consumer behavior, all of it is a direct product of human behavior. And a huge chunk of it, maybe even most of it, is a product of human social behavior. All right. Certainly even folk wisdom leads you to that idea. If you remember the idea of keeping up with the Joneses, right? That's consumer behavior being directed by social processes. So economics is heavily influenced by human social behavior. And so a lot of financial decision-making, investment strategies, consumer behavior, a lot of that research in economics social psychologists contribute to it. So much to the point, so much so that many times social psychologists who have their training in social psychology end up going to work in business schools. For example, Griskevicius, all right, got his PhD at Arizona State University, and his two committee chairs were social psychologists, two fairly famous social psychologists, Cialdini and Doug Kenrick, all right. You'll hear both of those names, including Griskevicius's, in this class. But Griskevicius works at a business school, all right, and he got his PhD in psychology under two social psychologists. Political science is also a field outside of psychology that heavily interacts with social psychology and covers a lot of the same material. Politics is all human social behavior. Now, it's usually restricted to negotiations of power structures, but that is just a small piece of social psychology. Even some of my own research begins to dabble into political psychology. So political science includes political psychology, and that political psychology is largely, if not almost entirely, social psychology. All right. Now, one thing that all of these fields of science, including those other fields of psychology, one thing that all of these fields have in common is the same thing that all sciences have in common. We share a common set of values, and these are those values. So those values are accuracy. We want to have an accurate answer. We want it to be verifiable. We want it to be able to replicate it. We want to be able to find it with other people. We want to have the right answer. And so we go to great lengths and to great pains to verify the answers we come up with. We want to be objective, and this is really hard. In fact, some research would suggest that it's almost impossible for people to do, but it is an ideal that scientists set out to live by, which is you take your personal beliefs, that includes religious, that includes political, that includes cultural. You take those beliefs and you set them aside, and you try to think of the explanations and assess those explanations, the evidence for and against those explanations, independently of your political, religious, cultural, or any other kind of beliefs. Now that's freaking hard to do. All right. In fact, many people fail at it. Elsewhere, I've written about and talked about how our field, not just social psychology, but not just social psychology, psychology and all of science has largely failed at this piece, especially when it comes to political objectivity. But objectivity is still the ideal that we as scientists share, regardless of what subject matter we're studying, clinical, social, cognitive, or outside of psychology. Another value that we all share is being skeptical. So, and this kind of goes hand in hand with being open-minded. We want to be open to new ideas, but we have to be skeptical of those ideas, especially if they fly in the face of prevailing explanations. And so we have certain rules that we abide by, like the weight of evidence. If someone comes to us with one study or a handful of studies that flies completely in the face of every bit of evidence that we've had up to this point, it is best practice to be skeptical of it. All right. Well, why? Well, again, we have to follow the evidence. Evidence in science picks the winner. Okay. And so if, I've got 5 studies that say B, but I've got 150 that say A, as a scientist, being objective, because again, I don't want my beliefs, my personal interests to bias my decision, I have to go with a numbers-based criterion, and that is the 150. 150 is greater than 5. All right. So I've got to go with the weight of evidence. All right. In the early days of evolution, right, which is one of the most verified theories in all of science, all right, it has probably the most evidence from the most fields for it. In its early days, it was met with a lot of skepticism by the scientific community in the early days. All right. In the scientific community now, it doesn't have much skepticism. There's a couple folks that still have some troubles with it, but 97% of the scientific community are all about it because they accept it, because for decades and decades and decades, we've now had mountains of evidence supporting the theory of evolution. And again, theory does not imply that it's just a guess, that it's just an explanation. A theory is an explanation that has then been verified multiple times and is based on a mountain of evidence. in science, we don't throw that word around easily. All right, a theory is a well-verified explanation. So as scientists, when new evidence comes up, we have to be skeptical, but at the same time open-minded. All right, you've got new evidence, you've got some evidence there showing what you're saying. All right, we'll test your hypothesis too and see how it stacks up against the theory that we have right now. All right, so scientists test that new hypothesis, they check it against the prevailing or existing explanations, and over time, evidence picks the winner. All right, and that's one way science, that's one of the reasons why adopting a scientific approach to the study of anything really is the best. Because yes, it's slow. It takes a long time. And if you look across the history of any field, you'll find really silly ideas. All right, if you look at physics, at one point they thought cold was an element. That in order to make something cold, you had to add the element of cold. Okay, so any field, any study of subject matter that studies that subject matter scientifically, because science is slow, it may have silly ideas come up, and those silly ideas may prevail for sometimes centuries, certainly decades, certainly years, right? But science is self-correcting. So science is not a quick activity, but give it enough time and it always corrects itself. All right, as long as people are adhering, as long as scientists adhere to these values and these ideals. All right, guys, that's it for this video. As always, if you have any questions, let me know. If not, have a great one, and I'll see you next time.